Hello everyone, this is Dalster and welcome to another episode review of Dark Side of the Ring, and in this episode it focuses on the life and tragic death of Chris Benoit, Nancy, and Daniel. Trigger warning, as this episode and video will explain murder and one person unaliving themselves. So if you're sensitive to one taking their own life, this episode and video might not be for you. I have already watched this episode a couple of times before, and this case has been on my mind for a very long time. There is a lot to be said about Chris Benoit and what he did to his wife and son, but I will focus on part 1 as there are 2 episodes for Chris. If you would like me to make another video of my thoughts of Chris Benoit and how I have followed this case for many years, comment down below. I will say that when I finished junior high, days later, Chris murdered his wife, son, and himself. It was all over the news and magazines, but it's still talked about on YouTube and crime shows. I will go over what the episode has to say. Chris Benoit was born Christopher Michael Benoit in Montreal, Quebec, Canada. He was born on May 21st, 1967. A lot of people in 1967 have died as of today, one of them being Eddie Guerrero. But my dad's still alive. As a teenager, Chris's first wrestling show was seeing the Dynamite Kid. He saw the Dynamite Kid doing a flying headbutt and decided to pursue wrestling. Chris went to Stampede Wrestling where he fought against wrestlers such as Chris Jericho. Jericho said that he was influenced by Benoit during their time there. Years later, another wrestler who worked with Benoit in ECW was Dean Malenko, who said that Chris was quiet and reserved outside of the ring, but inside the ring, he was a very serious worker. Jericho stated that Benoit would take his mistakes that he made in the ring seriously, as Benoit felt as though he was exposing wrestling somehow. But Jericho told Benoit that the crowd probably didn't notice the little mistakes. Benoit would discipline or punish himself for making minor mistakes by doing squats or some random exercise as said by Jericho. Another wrestler who took his craft seriously, such as Benoit, was Eddie Guerrero, who wrestled as Black Tiger in New Japan Pro Wrestling. In the beginning, Eddie could not stand Benoit when they first met in Japan, but they would eventually become the closest of friends after wrestling a couple of matches there. Jericho was known as Lionheart in Japan, while Benoit was known as the Pegasus Kid. Before I get to Chris Benoit and WCW, let's focus on Nancy Toffolini before she and Benoit met there. Nancy had 2 marriages before she met Chris. When she met Kevin Sullivan, who was a wrestler and a booker, she was already divorcing her first husband. She met Kevin in Florida Championship Wrestling, as his character in wrestling was a Satanist. The 2 of them married, and Nancy became a valet, which is a character that stays at the side of the wrestler and manages them, but does not wrestle. Nancy was known as Fallen Angel and got a lot of heat because people thought that she was possessed by Kevin, who at the time had a devilish gimmick. Kevin was really in love with Nancy, and they soon went to WCW, where they would meet Chris Benoit. Nancy in WCW was known as Woman and was a very confident, classy character. Going back to Chris Benoit, he, Eddie, and Dean Malenko were known as the Three Amigos in WCW. Kevin was a booker as well in WCW and liked Chris Benoit as he thought of Benoit as one of the greatest wrestlers of all time. So he booked Benoit a lot. Booking Benoit and putting him in a storyline with Kevin's wife Nancy at the time was the end of Kevin's marriage. In the storyline, Kevin had Woman leave Kevin's side and start a relationship with Chris. Behind wrestling, Nancy actually went to Chris whenever she and Kevin had arguments. Dean asked his wife Julie, who is a psychiatrist, if she could help Nancy with her problems. When Julie saw Nancy, she came with Chris and had a black eye. Nancy had told Julie that the black eye was from Kevin. At Bash at the Beach, Kevin and Chris had a match, and it looked as though they were throwing blows at each other instead of following the script. Chris broke Kevin's eardrum, and after the match was over, they were still beating each other up. Backstage, Chris gives Sandra, Nancy's sister, a phone. On the phone, Nancy tells her sister to go with Chris. When Sandra saw Nancy at the condo, Nancy looked beat up, and she said that Kevin was the one who hit her, and that she was leaving Kevin. In the episode, with captions, the producers of Vice had approached Kevin to comment on the allegations, and he denied that any abuse had happened between him and Nancy. Sandra said that Chris was nice to Nancy when she needed it. Vicky Guerrero said that Nancy was very in love with Chris, and she also became best friends with Nancy. Eventually, Chris and Nancy had Daniel, and he became the best man when Chris and Nancy got married. Chris's first son was David from his first wife, but David called Nancy mom instead of stepmom since she was a part of the family. David said that Daniel looked up to him when he was a lot younger and that they wanted to be tag team champions someday. Back to Chris, he, Eddie, and Dean walked out of WCW because the short wrestlers were not able to main event due to their height. All three of them went to WWF, now WWE. In WWE, Eddie was a huge star while Chris was known as the Rabid Wolverine or the Canadian Crippler. Chris Jericho said that Benoit never missed a wrestling show, but wished that he could be there for his kids during the holidays. He also said that Benoit was a good father. While on the road, Benoit and Eddie gave up a lot of things for wrestling. Sandra said that Chris and Eddie had a caring friendship. Their friendship lasted until Eddie died so suddenly. While they went to Minneapolis, Eddie was passing out and slipping away in his hotel room. At the hotel, Chavo, Chris, and Eddie were staying in the same hotel. Chavo gets a call from the hotel staff at 5:30 a.m., saying that something is wrong with his uncle Eddie as he did not answer his wake-up call. Chavo and the hotel staff go to Eddie's room and cut off the latch as Eddie was in the bathroom. Eddie was face down on the floor with a toothbrush in his hand. He then grabs Eddie as Eddie was gurgling. Sadly, Eddie dies in Chavo's arms. You can see from the look on Chavo's face while describing Eddie's death that he was really emotional. Minutes later, Chris calls Chavo and asks where he and Eddie were as they were going to the gym that following morning. Chavo then tells Chris that Eddie had died. All of a sudden, Chavo hears Chris wailing from the other side of the phone line. Vicky said that Vince called her to explain that Eddie had died. Shortly after Eddie died, Chris went to the hotel room and kissed Eddie's forehead as a way to say goodbye. Dean also did the same thing to Eddie. Eddie did not relapse as he had been off drugs for a long time. His death was ruled as heart disease and was 38 years old. Sandra said that she cried when she found out that Eddie died and thought of him, his family, and Chris. WWE did a tribute show for Eddie as Chris was very emotional in an interview that WWE did for the show, crying his heart out. Benoit said in the clip that he loved Eddie and that they will see each other again. Jericho said that Eddie's funeral was hard and that Benoit gave Jericho a sad hug and sobbed in Jericho's suit. Chavo said that Benoit showed a lot of emotion at the funeral, almost as if Chris had lost a spouse. Jericho said that when Eddie passed away, Benoit became distant to everyone. When he went to Europe for a WWE show shortly after Eddie's funeral, Benoit was still crying. Vicky said that Nancy helped her as she was mourning the loss of Eddie, her husband. She helped Vicky by taking care of her and her kids as Nancy had stayed at the house for a month. At Vicky and Eddie's house, Vicky said that she saw Chris on Eddie's side of the bed, crying as he was holding Eddie's pillow. One day, Vicky's daughters came to her and told Vicky that Chris was at Eddie's gym, crying. She said that Chris had told her that he felt lost without Eddie and cried in her arms. Chris had become more distant and Nancy would call Vicky or Sandra and ask if they knew anything about Chris. Even backstage, Chris would disappear. Sandra said that Chris would take different cars and drive in different areas to the gym. She also said that Chris would act differently as he thought that the wrestlers' kids were being kidnapped. She said that Chris was paranoid and did not want to be seen by anyone. Chris and Nancy would fight a lot because Chris was irritable at the time. The family gave Chris a journal where he would write to Eddie, and Chris felt as if Eddie was there as he was writing in the journal. Nancy wanted Chris to get out of wrestling during his last year of living. Jericho said that when they go to buildings to wrestle, Benoit would talk about how Eddie was there. Sandra said that Nancy felt like Chris's well-being was hurting because he was still wrestling and overworking himself. Chavo said that when he and Scott Armstrong were in a car, he got a call from Chris saying that Nancy and Daniel were having food poisoning and that they were throwing up. Until the end of the phone conversation, Chris told Chavo that he loved him, and that was it. Chavo said that it was very weird. At 5:30 a.m., Chavo gets a text from Chris saying that the dogs are in the pool area and that the back door is open. Chavo then gets the same text, but from Nancy's phone. A couple minutes later, he gets another text with directions to an airport. He tells Scott about the text. and Scott tells Chavo that he also got the same text. Johnny Ace asked Chavo if he had seen Chris, and he showed Johnny a text that Chris had sent. Vince McMahon sent a wellness check to Chris's house to see what was going on. Chavo said that Vince held a ring meeting hours later. Vicky felt as if something was wrong while she sat down. Vince stands in the ring as everyone else was sitting outside of the ring. He tells everyone that Chris, Nancy, and Daniel have passed away. Dean said that he remembered Vicky giving a hurling scream, so he took her to the back. As Chavo was walking to the meeting, he sees Vicky crying and tells Vince what had happened, and Vince tells Chavo that they're gone. Vince hugged Chavo super tight and Chavo started crying, not believing it to be true at first. At the time, WWE did not know any details as to what happened to Chris and his family. Everyone affected by this tragedy has longed for closure, especially us fans. Interviewers for this episode are Jim Ross, Vicky Guerrero, Chavo Guerrero Jr., Chris Jericho, David Benoit, son of Chris Benoit, Dean Malenko, Sandra Tofolini, sister of Nancy Tofolini, and Julie Malenko, wife of Dean. David called his father, Chris, one of the greatest wrestlers of all time, and played as his dad in the WCW Mayhem game on Nintendo. I give this episode a 10 out of 10 as it gives a really good description of certain events, up until the news that Chris and his family had died. It was a really intense episode, especially when I rewatched it sometimes. I'm glad that Vice was able to get Chris's son David for this episode, as it made it more surreal and interesting. If you go on YouTube and search for Chavo on the phone call with Chris, it sounds more creepy and intense. I felt so bad for Chavo as he was not only the last one to see Eddie alive, but was the last person to possibly have been Chris's last call. When Eddie died, it was actually one of the first deaths that I dealt with in a really sad way. There was 9/11 and my grandfather who had died in 1999, but Eddie's death was so sad and just felt closer to me. I remember some of the WWE wrestlers being interviewed for Eddie's tribute show, such as Rey Mysterio, JBL, and John Cena, but Chris was so sad, and you could tell that he was really destroyed. Even during the 10 bell ceremony, he was crying so much. To this day, WWE still talks about Eddie, and he is greatly missed. Last year, during the Christmas season, I bought the Eddie Guerrero Funko Pop with the pin. I'm also glad that they talked about Nancy and her past before she met Chris, as I never knew much about her until I watched this episode for the first time. She was a real friend, but I was grossed out by Vicky for two reasons. Felt like Vicky was way too openly when it came to her talking about Eddie having a nice butt and that he would perform wrestling moves on her, and it looked like she saw it in a sexual way. Another reason why I don't like Vicky is because last year she sided with her husband Chris instead of her daughter, who accused Vicky's husband of touching her inappropriately. This episode did make it seem like there was more to their friendship between Eddie and Chris, but I think they were just really good friends to one another. This episode came out in 2020 and it still is really hard to watch, as I had to take little breaks now and then. Some facts about Chris was that his Pegasus Kid image was in an episode of Ellen DeGeneres. Chris was a Triple Crown champion placed in number 12, but WWE probably does not acknowledge it. He also was a Triple Crown in WCW. In 2017, Kurt Angle considers Chris as his top 3 wrestlers and still acknowledges him. Chris spoke French and English fluently and was married before. He actually has a daughter that is still alive, but I wish she could have been interviewed for this episode, especially Chris's parents. I remember Michael, Chris's dad, being interviewed on CNN and other news stations. Maybe they just wanted to move forward from this tragedy. Anyway, this is Dalster, and I'll see you guys in the next episode. Comment, like, subscribe for more, and if you want me to do another video of my experience of Chris's death, comment down below. But until next time, bye guys, see you later.